Washington Sound Library presents Titanic, Everything Was Against Us. Written and produced by Barry Hurd and read by Hugh Dixon.
On the fateful night of the 14th of April 1912, the sky over the Atlantic was cloudless and bright stars blanketed the heavens from horizon to horizon. As the evening drew on, the temperature dropped rapidly to nearly freezing. There was no wind, and the sea was a flat calm, a rare and unusual phenomenon in this vast ocean. Through this stillness, the sea's smooth surface was only disturbed when the largest ship in the world, RMS Titanic, ploughed through it on her maiden voyage. She was carrying 1,308 passengers and a crew of 898. 2,206 souls in all. The huge ship was travelling at over 22 knots as she made her way towards New York. It was a destination she was fated not to reach. Instead, she was sailing towards her own immortal place in history, where her name will become synonymous with one of the world's most tragic maritime disasters. At 9 o'clock that evening, Captain E.J. Smith, known to everybody just as E.J., made his excuses to the party he was dining with in the a la carte restaurant and returned to the bridge. On duty, he found Second Officer Lightoller and Sixth Officer Moody. The captain entered into a conversation with Lightoller, which is repeated here, as it so clearly illustrates the calm, routine atmosphere on the bridge, only hours before the disaster. "It's very cold," Smith said. "Yes, it's very cold," agreed Lightoller. "In fact, it's only 1 degree above freezing. I've sent word down to the carpenter to keep an eye on the fresh water tanks, and rang up the engine room and told them it's freezing or will be during the night." "There's not much wind," observed the captain, as he stared out into the blackness ahead. "No, it's a flat calm, as a matter of fact," Lightoller replied. "A flat calm," the captain repeated in surprise, for this was very rare in the Atlantic. "Yes," said the second officer, "quite flat, there's no wind at all." Lightoller went on to say what a pity it was that there was not even a breeze. The ship was entering a region where ice had drifted further south than normal that year, on the Labrador Current, crossing the normal shipping routes, and a breeze created a telltale phosphorescent ripple round an iceberg's base, which at night helped to reveal its presence at a safe distance. The two men went on to speak of other means of pinpointing bergs, by reflected light from the ship, for example, or by their white outline, even if the berg was showing its blue or dark side towards the ship. The outcome of this conversation was that Lightoller felt confident that on such a clear, calm night as the 14th, an iceberg, even a small one or growler, would be spotted by the watch at 1.5 to 2 miles, which would give plenty of time to steer the ship safely round it. The captain, whose eyes were slowly becoming accustomed to the dark after leaving the brightly lit restaurant, looked forward and said, "It seems quite clear." "Yes, it is perfectly clear," agreed Lightoller. Smith then added, after staring out into the night for a while, "If it becomes the slightest degree hazy, we will have to slow down." At about 9:20, Captain Smith said he was going to his bunk in the chart room. As he left the bridge, he said, "If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know. I shall be just inside." At 9:30, Lightoller ordered Moody to tell Jewell and Simons, who were on duty in the crow's nest, to keep a sharp lookout for ice, particularly small ice and growlers, until daylight. They were also told to pass these instructions on to their reliefs, due on in half an hour's time. Jewell and Simons had come on watch at 8 o'clock, and by 9:30 they were very cold. There may not have been a wind that night, but the forward movement of the ship through the bitter air was enough to freeze a man to the bone. Simons had travelled over this route many times during the past few years, and he kept a watchful eye on the slight surface haze that lay along the horizon. It had been there when they'd come on watch, and it never seemed to alter, neither getting thicker nor dispersing as the minutes passed. Once or twice, Jewel saw Simons sniff at the cold air, a knowing look in his eye. Jewel said, "It's very cold here." "Yes," replied Simons, who sniffed again. "By the smell of it, there's ice about." "What do you mean by that?" asked the less experienced Jewel. "As a rule," Simons told him, "you can smell ice before you get to it." On the bridge, Second Officer Lightoller finished his watch. He had been closely watching the temperature, and was also keeping a sharp lookout for ice or surface haze, frequently using his binoculars to check anything that looked suspicious. At 9:45, the standby quartermaster went to call First Officer Murdoch. On his return to the bridge, he took readings from the thermometer, barometer, and cherub log, and checked the temperature of the water, making a note of all the readings in the log. At 10 o'clock, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee climbed up the iron ladder inside the foremast to relieve Jewel and Simons in the crow's nest. Before they went down for a welcome hot drink, they passed on Lightoller's order to keep a sharp lookout for icebergs and growlers. For some reason, the binoculars that were supposed to be in the crow's nest to help the lookouts with their job were missing, and had been since they left Southampton. The two men standing in the freezing cold, high above the deck, had to rely on their eyes alone for this important job. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch relieved Second Officer Lightoller. Murdoch was wearing his overcoat, and commented, "It's pretty cold." "Yes," replied Lightoller. "It's freezing." Lightoller then passed on to Murdoch the usual items of information, such as the ship's position, her course, speed, weather conditions, and ice reports, etc. After taking note of all this, Murdoch went to inspect the night order book in the chart room, which had a footnote written in it, warning of ice. Lightoller remained with Murdoch on the bridge until the latter's eyes had become accustomed to the dark. As they stood together, they both remarked on the ship's steadiness and lack of vibration. Lightoller expressed his concern that at any time they could be up around the ice, and that there was no definition between the horizon and the sky, with no moon, which would make icebergs harder to see. Finally, before he left the bridge, Lightoller also told Murdoch of the order he had telephoned through to the crow's nest, and the warning he had sent to the carpenter and engine room as to the freezing temperature. Sixth Officer Moody was to remain on duty with Murdoch until his watch finished. At the wheel, Quartermaster Alfred Oliver was relieved by Robert Hitchens, saying as he handed over to the Cornishman, "North 71 West," which Hitchens repeated in a murmur as he grasped the spokes and began to stare into the glowing binnacle. Alfred Oliver then remained on the bridge as standby. Murdoch, Moody, and the two men in the crow's nest were the only 4 men on watch that night, looking out ahead for any danger, as the Titanic headed towards the huge ice field they all knew was ahead of them. The only thing that was in doubt was when they would encounter it. As Murdoch settled down for his watch, the air temperature had dropped to freezing point. The Cherub, the patent log, showed that over the last 2 hours the ship had travelled 45 sea miles, averaging 22.5 knots, and still all her boilers were not lit. Murdoch knew that there was talk of letting the Titanic run at full speed for a few hours the next day to see what she could do, but nobody had told him about this officially. As the next hour and a half passed, the weather remained clear and calm. At 11:30, the 2 lookouts in the crow's nest saw a slight but definite haze dead ahead. For some reason better known to themselves, they didn't report this to the bridge. It wasn't until 10 minutes later that Fred Fleet, without consulting Lee, reached across and rang the crow's nest's gong 3 times. This was the signal that there was something dead ahead. Fleet then grabbed the telephone, connecting the crow's nest to the bridge, which was answered by Moody. Fleet shouted down the phone, "Are you there?" Moody replied, "Yes, what do you see?" "Iceberg! Right ahead!" he shouted excitedly. "Thank you," said Moody, who turned to repeat the warning to First Officer Murdoch. "Iceberg right ahead." Murdoch didn't hesitate for a second. He shouted to the helmsman, "Hard to starboard." Hitchens obeyed immediately, swinging the wheel as fast as he could until it was hard over. Slowly the Titanic began to answer her helm, and her prow began to swing to port. The steering gear in ships at the time worked as if the wheel was a tiller, therefore turning the wheel to starboard caused the ship to turn to port. Murdoch, in the meantime, had ordered the engines to stop, then to full astern, by the engine room telegraph. He had also rung the bell that warned those below that the watertight doors were about to be shut. After waiting a few seconds, he pulled the switch, which automatically sealed the ship off into its watertight compartments. From the time Fleet had rung down his warning to the bridge, it took 40 agonizing seconds, with the Titanic still travelling at over 20 knots, before she glanced the huge berg that fate had put in her path. If the Titanic had hit it head-on, she would probably have survived and been able to limp into New York. Unluckily, answering her helm as quickly as she did, she had turned 2 points to port, some 22.5 degrees after Murdoch had given the order. It wasn't quite enough to clear the berg, although Fleet said later he had seen the prow turn into the clear. The ship touched the ice for about 10 seconds, far below the waterline, along her starboard side. Her plates were torn open along a section of the hull about 300 feet long. It was not a wide rent, and it was not continuous. The ice tore and poked at Titanic's plates, opening them to the sea along the side of 6 of her watertight compartments. If the gash had been shorter, and had not damaged boiler rooms 5 and 6, the ship might have lived. She could float with 4 of her forward compartments flooded, but not with 5 or more. Fate was not on the side of Titanic, and she had less than 3 hours to live. As the iceberg passed along the side of the ship, it bobbed slightly from the collision. Witnesses who saw it said it seemed to emit an almost luminous haze. Slowly its huge, menacing shape passed beyond the stern, and it vanished from view into the darkness. Yet this iceberg, which the forces of nature had taken hundreds of thousands of years to create, had in 10 short seconds taken a dreadful toll on what man at the time boasted was one of his greatest achievements, a ship that was thought to be unsinkable. In this brief meeting, mortal damage had been done to the Titanic, and she was to founder, taking with her to the depths the lives of over 1,500 souls. The idea to build 3 liners, Olympic, Titanic, and later Britannic, which were to be larger and more luxurious than anything then afloat, was conceived in 1907. It was suggested after a fine dinner by Lord Pirrie, who was chairman of Harland and Wolff, the Irish shipbuilders, and also a director of the White Star Line, to J. Bruce Ismay, the chief executive of White Star Line and president of the American company that actually owned White Star, International Mercantile Marine Company, or IMM for short, which had been set up by the wealthiest financier in the United States, John Pierpont Morgan. So it's not surprising that his idea to build the 3 45,000-ton Olympic-class ships was soon adopted by Ismay, who wanted White Star to break Cunard's dominant hold over the lucrative North Atlantic route. The finance for the venture will be provided by J.P. Morgan from the coffers of IMM. To find out how this trio of Ismay, Perry, and Morgan, and the companies they controlled, became so entangled in such incestuous dealings, it may be worthwhile taking a brief look at the history of the White Star Line, which reveals a catalogue of shady dealings and shoddy seamanship, neither of which, it's fair to say, was uncommon in the 19th and early 20th century, but the activities of the owners and the commanders of the White Star Line surpassed most. The White Star Line was founded in 1845 by Henry T. Wilson and his partner John Pilkington, and it began to establish itself on the Australian run, taking goods and migrants out and bringing back gold, whale oil, and wool. In 1863, the company bought the 2,033-ton sail-assisted steamer Royal Standard, which made an uneventful maiden voyage to Australia. However, on her way back, 2 weeks out from Melbourne, she became the first of White Star's flagships to hit an iceberg. Her captain, G.H. Dowell, wrote, "The ship was suddenly enveloped by a thick fog. At the same moment, the lookout sang out, 'Broken water ahead.' The next moment saw a large iceberg close under the starboard bow. The helm was immediately put hard a starboard, bringing the ship parallel with the berg. The sea gradually settled her down upon it, thus bringing the yards in contact with the berg. Before they broke, they struck the berg several times, bringing down large masses of ice on the deck. Incredibly, her hull was not damaged, and she was able to sail on to Rio de Janeiro to effect repairs. The Royal Standard was extremely lucky to have had such a close shave with this huge berg and survive. However, the White Star Line was not as fortunate with its finances and was in serious trouble. To alleviate this, in 1864 the directors tried to merge the line with two other shipping companies. But after an investigation by the London Stock Exchange into rumours of insider trading and illegal holdings by directors in the names of nominees, the idea was dropped. The White Star Line struggled on, getting ever deeper into difficulties, so much so that when it took delivery of another steamer it had ordered, it had to be sold immediately so that the company itself could remain afloat. In 1866, in one last desperate attempt to save the company, the directors tried to break into the lucrative North Atlantic market. They failed to get a foothold, and when two of the banks that backed the company also collapsed, the White Star Line had to be sold. The assets of the line, and what was left of the goodwill, was bought by Thomas Henry Ismay for £1,000. A new company was formed called the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited, which became the new owner of White Star. Next, Ismay made a deal with Harland & Wolff for the construction of 4 ships. As these were built, they were immediately put onto the richest run of all, the North Atlantic route, although the old run to Australia was not ignored completely. The first of the new White Star ships was called Oceanic, after the new company. The second was Atlantic. In fact, all the names of the line's new ships would from then on end with IC, as most of the Cunadas ended with IA. The finance for the new company's rapid expansion was found through a Liverpool financier of German extraction named Gustavus Schwale, whose nephew, Gustav Wolff, was by coincidence with the shipbuilders Harland & Wolff, who had their yard in Belfast. Later, to strengthen the bond between Ismay's White Star Line and the Irish shipbuilders, a new deal was struck. This was that the White Star Line would order their ships from Harland & Wolff exclusively, and both Wolff and Edward Harland would buy shares in the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited. It was a very satisfactory arrangement for all concerned. The first major disaster to befall the White Star Line under its new management was on the 1st of April 1873, when the Atlantic, a 3,700-ton sail-assisted steamer, carrying about 1,000 passengers and crew, ran aground during a terrible storm while she was running for cover in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Atlantic was only about 15 miles from port when the disaster struck her, costing the lives of 546, including nearly 200 children. At the subsequent inquiry, the blame for this tragedy was fixed squarely on the shoulders of the captain. It was found that sloppy navigation had placed the ship at least 12 miles west of where her officers thought she was. And to make things worse, her 33-year-old captain, James Agnew Williams, was asleep in the chart room when she struck. Williams had his master's ticket suspended for 2 years. It was not until 1893 that another major tragedy took place. This was the unexplained loss in the North Atlantic of the largest cargo ship in the world, the 6,594-ton cattle steamer Naronic, on her 13th voyage. 6 years later, in 1899, the liner Germanic capsized under the weight of ice in her upper works and sank in New York Harbor. So, as can be seen, even for the crazy buccaneering days of early steam, the record of the White Star Line was not an enviable one. Even so, in 1901, John Pierpont Morgan, the wealthiest man in America, who wanted to break the British hold on the North Atlantic route, made an offer for the White Star Line. The bid was at such an inflated price that J. Bruce Ismay, who had taken over the company after his father's death in 1899, couldn't refuse. The price for the White Star Line had been inflated to nearly 10 times its value, at just the right time from the shareholders' point of view, because of the recent huge profits the line had made from government Boer War contracts. So now we have established the triumvirate of men who made the building of the Titanic and her sisters possible. J.P. Morgan, the American who would finance and own her; J. Bruce Ismay, who as chief executive of the White Star Line ordered her and would operate her; and Lord Perry, chairman of Harland and Wolff, the company that would build her. Even after White Star had changed hands into the charge of its new American owner, bad luck still seemed to dog the company. 1907 brought the grounding of the 12,500-ton Swavic near Land's End, Cornwall. Then in 1909, just 3 years before the disaster was to strike the Titanic, the 15,378-ton Republic collided with the Florida in fog off Massachusetts and eventually sank. Fortunately, because of wireless, which brought the Baltic quickly to the rescue, only a few of the 1,650 aboard the two ships were lost. Work on the first of the Olympic-class liners, which was to be called the Olympic, started on the 16th of December 1908, and she was given keel number 400. Work on the Titanic, keel number 401, started in March 1909. One of the many myths that has grown up around the Titanic is connected with her hull number, 390904. It was claimed that if you looked at this number in a mirror, it appeared to read, "No Pope." The Catholic workers at Harland and Wolff are said to have complained to the management and wanted it changed. That this number could be seen as an ill omen before the disaster is hard to digest, and no real evidence that it was even noticed by the largely Protestant workforce in the Belfast shipyard makes it even harder to swallow. The skeletons of both ships were more or less identical, with vertical frames spaced a yard apart, except in the bow and stern sections, where they were closer, to add strength to the two giants. 15 transverse bulkheads, crisscross beams, girders and pillars were also put into place, ready to have the mild steel plates riveted into position. Both ships measured 882 feet 6 inches in length by 92 feet 6 inches at their broadest, about 10 to 1, which was considered the right proportions at the time for speed and economy. The ships were built with a 5-foot 3-inch double bottom, which was almost flat and very strong. This area contained tanks of water for the boilers as well as fresh water for the passengers and crew. Amidships, on either side of the bottom, were a pair of 300-foot bilge keels to reduce the ship's rolling in heavy seas. One of the most published features about the construction of the Olympic and Titanic were the 15 transverse watertight bulkheads. These were fitted with doors, 12 of which could be closed in an emergency by the flick of a switch from the bridge. Shipbuilder magazine wrote that these watertight compartments made the two sisters practically unsinkable. As time went by and the two ships neared completion, the word practically disappeared from most articles written about them, and they became just known as unsinkable. It's fair to say that no one at White Star or Harland and Wolff ever went so far as to claim that the ships were unsinkable. In a head-on collision when the hull was breached, the forward bulkheads will be able to contain any water entering the ships. The same applied if the Olympic or Titanic were hit broadside by another ship. In this event, even if 2 of the watertight compartments were ruptured, they could still safely remain afloat. In fine weather, it was estimated that they would still not founder with up to 4 of their compartments open to the sea. Lastly, with the extra strength built into the rigid keel and double bottom, they would be able to withstand the worst grounding. What else, it was asked, could happen to them? As man forever strives to advance his knowledge and skills, sometimes these new discoveries are put into practical use before they are properly proven, which has caused many disasters, especially in the 20th century. An example of this was the unforeseen metal fatigue problem in the Comet, the first passenger jet airliner built after the war. Or another more recent catastrophe was the failure of the O-rings at low temperatures in the space shuttle, causing it to explode. In the Titanic, too, there was a similar flaw. In the fabric of her giant hull, there was a weakness which nobody responsible for her design or construction knew about or understood at the time. In fact, it was not discovered until samples of her steel plates were brought up from the wreck and examined in 1993. It was then learnt that in freezing cold water, the steel used to build the Titanic became brittle. This would have certainly contributed to the damage done to the ship by the iceberg, as much of the metal's resistant qualities would have been lost and the plates would have been ripped open like paper. We must look briefly at some of the events that occurred during the Olympic's early service, for the story of the two ships goes hand in hand, and the consequences leading from some of the incidents that befell the Olympic were linked to the disaster that overcame her sister Titanic. The Olympic was launched on the 20th of October 1910. There was no traditional champagne bottle smashed against her bow, but the huge crowd that gathered to see the event was full of dignitaries and reporters. The ship, then the largest in the world, slid majestically stern first into the River Lagan, her passage being helped by over 20 tons of grease. As she made this her first journey, she reached a speed of nearly 13 knots, which was checked as she entered the water by 6 huge anchors and 80 tons of cable. Once afloat, a gust of wind caught her, blowing her against the dry dock and denting some of her plates. Not a lucky start for the new flagship of the White Star Line, but it didn't mar the day. The next significant date for the two sisters was the 31st of May 1911. This was the day the Titanic was to be launched. To maximize the amount of publicity the White Star Line could muster for her two giants, it was also timed to coincide with the Olympic finishing her sea trials and receiving her seaworthiness certificate from the Board of Trade Surveyor, pronouncing her ready for service. Early in the morning, a steamer from Fleetwood brought several hundred dignitaries who were guests of Holland and Wolfe to watch the launch, wine and dine, then witness the departure of the Olympic on her way to Liverpool. More than 100,000 people turned out for this dual event, which was a milestone in maritime history. Boats full of sightseers filled the harbour. A ferry, plying back and forth, belching black smoke, was charging 2 shillings for cruises past the Olympic. On the County Antrim side, every vantage point was taken as crowds jostled to see the Titanic slide into the river. In the yard itself, 3 stands had been erected for the occasion. These were filled only by the people who were lucky enough to receive an invitation for the launch party. Naturally, there was an abundance of well-known faces from the press. There had never been a crowd like it before for any launch, and they erupted with a huge cheer as the Titanic slid stern first down the stipway into the River Lagan. After her launch, the Titanic was pulled by a fleet of tugs to the wharf that had been specially built for the fitting out of the 2 Leviathans. Here, a host of skilled craftsmen, joiners, electricians, carpenters, and plumbers would throng all over the ship, preparing her for sea. 29 huge boilers, 159 furnaces in all, had to be installed in 6 boiler rooms. Coal bunkers rose from the tank top to the underside of F-deck, and when finished, they would have a combined capacity of over 8,000 tons. 2 refrigeration engines stood in the port engine room. 4 400-kilowatt steam-powered generators, with dynamos to produce electricity to drive 150 separate electric motors, were arranged in pairs aft of the turbine engine room. Electricity in the Olympics was in abundance and used lavishly, for depending on it were cranes, winches, lifts, heaters, cookers, telegraphs, watertight doors, and an internal telephone exchange, plus many more gadgets, including 1,500 bell pushes. 2 separate circuits and reserve storage batteries served the Marconi wireless set, the continual working of which, and the brave men that operated it, will become an important part of the Titanic's story. The masts and funnels, the 4th of which was a dummy used for ventilation, had to be erected and the lifeboats put in place. As for facilities for the passengers, they are best explained in a contemporary journal written shortly after the disaster. It seemed as if the builders of the Titanic had been riotous in their endeavour to make this greatest of ships the ultimate example of modern luxury, beyond which it would be impossible to go. On the 10 decks you might forget the cares of life, the squalor and ugliness of life, even the duties of life, and in this sea palace of the Titanic Queen spend the days of the voyage in continual pleasure and delight. These sound like words of exaggeration, but the Titanic was herself an exaggeration of ordinary things. Here any passenger might sit in a tropical veranda restaurant, where vines grew upon a latticework of windows, through which there streamed artificial sunlight. It was called the Café Parisien, and here at night the band played the gayest tunes of life, French chansons and American ragtime dances, and the light melodies which charm away the shadows of the soul. Until suddenly the tune changed one night into that hymn which has become more sacred since. Here was a gymnasium splendidly equipped so that men might counteract the effects of luxury by strenuous exercise. There was a racket court for ladies and gentlemen of active mood. Turkish and electric baths and a great swimming bath luxuriously appointed were provided for the first and second-class passengers. The dining rooms, staterooms and common rooms were furnished in various periods and styles, copied faithfully from old models, so that English gentlemen might sit in rooms panelled and adorned like those of Haddon Hall, and fair women might have their beauty reflected in oval mirrors hanging upon walls like those of Versailles when Marie Antoinette played with her ladies. For the payment of £870 per voyage, the richest man on earth would not lack a single comfort that his wealth might buy. Even the third-class dining saloon, seating 500 passengers, and the other third-class accommodation was as richly and beautifully decorated as though kings and queens were on the third-class list. All the grandeur that had been built into the Olympic and the Titanic was in an effort to entice the elite of British and American society to travel by White Star. For up until then, the cream of British aristocracy had a tendency to favour the excellent level of service provided on the fast ships of the Cunard line. Only in speed were the two sisters unable to compete. They were built for luxury, not for high speed. Another distortion of the facts often put forward about the Titanic disaster is that the captain was going for a record crossing on her maiden voyage. This is not only untrue, it was impossible. The record, or blue riband, was held from 1907 until 1929 by the Cunarder Mauritania, with an average speed of 27.4 knots. The Mauritania, at only 31,900 tons to Titanic's 46,000, had turbines that could produce 70,000 horsepower, compared with the 46,000 delivered by the two reciprocating engines and one turbine aboard the Titanic, which might have attained a top speed of 24 knots at most. It's necessary at this juncture to return once more to the events that befell the Olympic during the months while the Titanic was being fitted out. The Olympic's maiden voyage began on the 14th of June 1911, for which she was fully booked. After leaving Southampton, where she was waved bon voyage by another huge crowd of well-wishers, she sailed first to Cherbourg in France to pick up more passengers, then west to Queenstown on the south coast of Ireland, before she began her first crossing of the Atlantic. She had an uneventful voyage to New York. But as she docked at the White Star's Manhattan Pier, once again bad luck struck. The tug O.L. Halenbeck was standing by near the Olympic's stern, when the huge liner's starboard propeller, which had already been stopped, started to turn again, in answer to an order from the bridge. The tug suddenly found itself trapped under the huge liner's stern, and nearly sank as the propeller sucked her in. Her stern frame, rudder and wheel shafts were sheared off, but fortunately nobody was hurt, and damage to the Olympic was only minor. The incident with the O.L. Halenbeck, which could have been far worse than it turned out, didn't stop the Olympic settling down to her new schedule. This was a 3-weekly turnaround in partnership with two of the older White Star liners, Majestic and Oceanic, each ship leaving Southampton every third Wednesday and arriving the following Wednesday in New York. There, 3.5 days were allowed for coaling and revictualling, and the ships would sail again on the following Saturday. This routine, however, was not to last for long, as misfortune was to strike the Olympic again on the 20th of September 1911. On this day, the Olympic was steaming down Southampton Water at the beginning of her 5th run to New York. On the bridge was her captain, Edward John Smith, Commodore of the White Star Line. Next to him, giving the navigational orders, was a Trinity House pilot with 30 years' experience, George William Bowyer. The Olympic cleared Southampton Water and negotiated an inverted S-turn to pass the Bramble Sandbank, so that she could sail down Spithead to round the Isle of Wight on her way to Cherbourg. Here she was rammed by the Royal Navy armoured cruiser HMS Hawke that was returning to Portsmouth after a routine engine test. Hawke had been steaming to the starboard side and slightly ahead of the Olympic as they both came on a converging course in the narrow channel. The captain of the cruiser decided to cross under the Olympic's bow and considered he had ample room to make the manoeuvre, while Bowyer, on the bridge of the Olympic, totally misread the Hawke's intention and increased speed, thinking that the cruiser would pass under his stern. Captain Smith, who was watching the Hawke from the bridge, said to the pilot, "I don't believe he will go under our stern, Bowyer." The pilot replied, "If she's going to strike, let me know in time to put the helm hard a port." "Is she going to strike us, sir?" "Yes, Bowyer," Smith said calmly. "She is going to strike us in our stern. He's starboarding, and he's going to hit us." Bowyer called urgently to the quartermaster, "Hard a port, helm, hard a port!" But it was too late. Once again, a brief reminder for those not acquainted with the way orders were given to helmsmen prior to 1928. Otherwise, the events that occurred between the Olympic and the Hawke could prove confusing. When the order was given to turn to starboard, the ship would turn to port, and vice versa. It was as if the ship was still being steered by a tiller rather than a wheel. It was brought out in the inquiry following the collision that on the bridge of the Hawke, her captain, Commander W.F. Blunt, had said to his navigation officer, Lieutenant R. Aylan, when they first saw Olympic, "If she is going east, she will not have much room to turn. We will give her as much room as possible." He then ordered port helm, meaning the ship should turn to starboard, to open the gap between the Hawke and the liner. But the Hawke made a sudden lurch and started to swing around towards the Olympic. Blunt shouted, "What are you doing? Port! Port! Hard a port!" Still the Hawke's bow was heading straight for the towering side of the Olympic. "Stop port! Full astern starboard!" Blunt ordered as he watched the gap between the two ships narrow. Petty Officer First Class Ernest Hunt tried to turn the ship's wheel, but he found he couldn't move it. "Helm jammed, sir!" he shouted. The officer of the watch and another seaman ran to the quartermaster's assistance. But even with the three of them pulling at it, they couldn't force the wheel to move. The gearing had somehow seized up. The captain himself now leapt down the ladder from the bridge to the wheelhouse and operated the engine-room telegraph to full astern, but with no effect. Blunt watched horrified as his ship still swung towards the Olympic, knowing there was nothing more he could do. He clung on tightly as the heavy ram attached to the cruiser's bow struck the liner below the waterline, some 85 feet from her stern. The two ships parted, and then the ram struck the liner again, this time above the waterline, causing another huge hole to open up in the Olympic's side. As the Olympic reeled with the impact of the collision, two of her watertight compartments started to fill, and her starboard propeller was damaged. The Hawke started to list alarmingly, until the ram that had done all the damage broke off, and the cruiser, her bow sadly mangled and twisted, eventually righted herself again, her forward compartment flooding. As the two ships drew apart, the Hawke's steering gear, that had so strangely jammed just a few seconds before, began to respond again normally. It was put forward at the later inquiry that the Hawke was simply sucked towards the Olympic by the little understood force of suction, which caused the collision. Both ships were able to limp back to port after the incident. Captain Smith was exonerated from any blame in both these misfortunes. The Hawke went on to serve in the First World War, and on the 15th of October 1914 she was torpedoed by a German U-boat when she blew up and sank in 6 minutes, taking with her to the bottom most of her crew of 550. Back in Southampton, the Olympic was laid up for 2 weeks, while temporary patches, wood above the waterline, steel plates below, were installed, so that she could sail back to Harland and Wolff's in Belfast, where the only dry dock in the world big enough to accommodate her great size could be found. Here again, the stories of the two ships link, with what turned out to be tragic consequences for the Titanic. On the Olympic's arrival at Harland and Wolff, the Titanic, already being fitted out in the Thompson graving dock, had to be towed out to be replaced by her sister to undergo repairs. It was also looked upon as an opportune moment for White Star to have some minor modifications and improvements made to the ship. which her short time in service had brought to light. Work on the Titanic naturally slowed down, as workmen assigned to her were transferred onto her damaged sister. The White Star management also realized that this would force them to delay Titanic's planned maiden voyage on the 20th of March 1912. Consequently, on the 10th of October, the company released a new date for her first Atlantic crossing, the 10th of April 1912, and the ship's fate was sealed. One can only speculate that if the Olympic had only given HMS Hawke a few more feet in the Solent, or vice versa, the Titanic would have sailed in March, and this story, the story of the most famous liner in the world, might never have been written. On the 30th of November, repairs to the Olympic were completed, and she returned to Southampton to resume service. Titanic was towed back to the Thompson graving dock, where her fitting out continued at top speed, with a full work crew once again. But the White Star jinx was to strike the Olympic once more, before the Titanic was to leave Belfast. This time, on a return journey from New York on the 24th of February 1912, a shock was felt throughout the ship, when one of the 26-ton port propeller blades broke off, after striking an uncharted submerged obstruction as she sailed over the Grand Banks. The Olympic was able to continue her journey, and arrived in Southampton on the 28th, but not before more disruption was caused when a lunatic who had been deported from the United States and had slipped away from his guard was lost overboard. Once again the Olympic had to return to Belfast for major repairs in the Thompson graving dock, from which, to accommodate her, the nearly completed Titanic had to be hauled out, disrupting and delaying the work on her. Strangely, it was at this time that Ismay ordered steel-framed screens with sliding windows to be fitted to the forward third of A deck. It was very unusual for such major modifications to be made to a ship so late in her construction. Ismay explained that it was in response to a passenger's comment about spray on the maiden voyage of the Olympic that made him think of it. However, the Olympic was to sail on for another 25 years without her passengers having the benefit of similar screens being fitted, although the Britannic, when the third sister was finally built, did have them put in place. These screens along A deck are the easiest way to distinguish the two sisters apart. The windows on B deck are another, as on the Titanic they are less uniform. In 1912, as now, the two ships were often confused. Many postcards sold of the Titanic were often photographs of the Olympic. One was actually of the Lusitania at Cunarda. On the 6th of March, at Harland and Wolff, the two sisters were photographed together for the last time, as they changed places in the Thompson graving dock. In this photograph, the Titanic still didn't have the screens. Olympic sailed for Southampton on the 7th of March, and resumed service on the 13th, leaving for New York. The Olympic was to outlive her sister Titanic by 25 years, eventually being broken up in 1937. After her shaky start, she went on to give exemplary service during peace and war. In 1918, she rammed and sank a German U-boat. Eventually, as the years went by, she earned the nickname of Old Reliable. But the jinx was always there, for in 1924 she backed into the SS Fort George in New York Harbor, and in 1934 she crushed the Nantucket lightship in fog, killing 7 of the crew. Titanic's sea trials were intended to start on the 1st of April 1912, but bad weather delayed them until the 2nd. Commodore of the White Star Line, Captain E.J. Smith, transferred from the Olympic, was on the bridge in command, as the liner steamed out into the Belfast Loch, a long bay opening onto the North Channel of the Irish Sea. In the place of Lord Pirrie, who was ill with prostate gland trouble, was Thomas Andrews, managing director of Harland and Wolff. J. Bruce Ismay, who was also missing, was represented by Harold Sanderson, who was a director of the White Star Line. The Titanic, being the second of the Olympic class to take her trials, failed, it seems, to create the same interest as did the Olympic, and deputies for the builders and the company that would soon take her over were, it would appear, adequate for this occasion. Francis Carruthers, who had already made at least 2,000 visits to the Titanic while she was being constructed, was the surveyor for the Board of Trade, who on this day would see the ship put through her paces. It had been Carruthers that had also issued the certificate for the Olympic 10 months earlier. Then it had taken him a lot longer to be satisfied with the ship's capabilities, Olympic's trials lasting 2 days, while Titanic's were over in 12 hours. Nevertheless, he had to perform a string of manoeuvres, including starting and stopping with various engine combinations. The dimension of her turning circle was measured at 3,850 feet at 20.5 knots, while moving forward only 2,100 feet. Carruthers, it seems, was impressed with this. During the emergency stop, the ship took 850 yards to stop, with her engines full astern. She also had to run a 2-hour straight course, during which she made an average speed of 18 knots. On her return, Carruthers made the quartermaster swing the helm from side to side to test her handling, with which he seemed satisfied. Lastly, the surveyor asked the captain to have the boat swung out, not lowered, just swung out, and the anchors dropped. After these last 2 things were performed to his satisfaction, Carruthers signed the certificate declaring Titanic was suitable for passengers and emigration for 1 year. Not once during her trials did she have to make maximum revolutions or run a measured mile. Barely an hour after Carruthers had left the ship, Titanic became the property of the White Star Line, Sanderson and Andrews having formally signed the papers transferring the ship from builder to owner. She then left Belfast and sailed for Southampton, where she docked just after midnight on the 4th of April. During this 570-mile run, she averaged more than 20 knots, at one time reaching 23.5, the fastest she would ever go. On this voyage, the White Star jinx struck again, when a fire broke out in No. 10 coal bunker, in boiler room No. 6. Fires in bunkers were not uncommon in ships at that time, but this one was to remain burning until just before she sank. For by this time, Titanic had only 11 days left to live. Because of a national coal strike that had been going on for 6 weeks, Atlantic shipping traffic had been badly disrupted, and many ships lay idle in Southampton, waiting to fill their bunkers. Olympic, steaming at a reduced speed to conserve fuel on her last run from New York, had brought back extra coal for herself and Titanic, who was also forced to poach fuel from other IMM ships stranded in port, so that she could leave on schedule. 4,427 tons in all were scavenged from these sources, to add to the 1,880 tons she had in her bunkers when she arrived from Belfast, some of which was on fire in No. 10. She would have burnt while in Southampton about 400 to 500 tons to keep the ship's equipment and lights going. So when she did sail on the 10th, her bunkers were woefully low, carrying only about 5,800 tons instead of the 8,000 she was designed to hold. This was easily enough to get to New York, but it would restrict the ship from running at full speed for any length of time if the captain or owners wanted to see how fast she would go, as this would increase fuel consumption considerably. Another consequence of the coal strike was that Titanic was grossly underbooked for her maiden voyage, as people were delaying their journeys to America until it was over. The company made every effort to fill these vacancies, and a massive advertising campaign was launched to encourage passengers to book at once on the largest and most luxurious ship in the world. Over the few days before she left for New York, Titanic's huge proportions were continually plastered across newspapers and posters across the country. They boasted of her 66,000 tons displacement, 45,324 tons register, 324 tons heavier than her sister Olympic. The extra weight was mainly due to the screens put on A deck at the last minute. Otherwise, all the other dimensions of the two ships were the same, both being 882 feet 6 inches long by 92 feet 6 inches. White Star boasted that Titanic was even more luxurious than the Olympic, with new features like the Café Parisien and even more opulent first-class suites. Yet despite all White Star's efforts, the Titanic was to sail just over half full, not helped by the last-minute cancellations of about 50 first-class passengers, including J.P. Morgan, the ship's American owner. While the Titanic was being coaled, the ship's first, second and third-class larders were being stored with vast quantities of food and drink, including 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 7,500 pounds of bacon and ham, plus coffee, tea, milk, the list was endless. For the bars, there were 20,000 bottles of beer, 1,500 bottles of wine, 850 bottles of spirits, plus 15,000 bottles of mineral water. Tableware for the passengers included 12,000 dinner plates, 4,500 soup plates, cups, jugs, tumblers, glasses and cutlery, etc., etc. The linen stores had to be brought on board too. 15,000 single sheets, 3,000 double sheets, 7,500 bath towels, 25,000 fine towels, blankets, tablecloths, counterpanes, all of which had to be stored by the stewards. Nothing, it seems, had been overlooked. On board there was everything that was necessary to make sure the passengers' every need was catered for on Titanic's maiden voyage. The only thing missing was enough space in the lifeboats for all on board. Why then was there not enough space in the boats? The answer is simple. People had become complacent, as had governments. What could sink a ship like the Titanic, with her 16 watertight compartments and her double bottom? A look at the safety record for Atlantic crossings in the 20 years preceding the disaster helps us to understand why people might have felt the dangers of sea travel had been overcome by scientific advancements. In the 10 years between 1891 and 1901, out of the 6 million people who crossed on the Anglo-American route, only 9 passengers were lost. Between 1901 and 1911, there have been only 57 casualties. The White Star Line was able to boast that during this last decade, only 2 of their passengers had been lost. At the British inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic, the reasons given by officials of the Board of Trade regarding the lack of sufficient lifeboats was that watertight bulkheads, wireless, and the safe transatlantic sailing tracks agreed among shipping lines in 1898 were the main factors behind the low lifeboat provision accepted before the disaster. Also, on the subject of safety, Titanic's captain, E.J. Smith, was quoted to have said to a reporter in the New York Times in 1907, "I will say that I cannot imagine any conditions that would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." Also in the same interview, Smith was asked, "Have you ever been involved in any dramatic incidents in your long career?" To this he replied that he hadn't, and nor did he anticipate any. This answer, if we look at E.J.'s record, was stretching the truth a little. Edward John Smith was born in 1850 at Hanley in the Potteries. He left school at 13 and joined the Merchant Navy to serve an apprenticeship under sail. He joined White Star as a junior officer in 1880, getting his first command in 1887, while he was still in his late 30s. In January 1889, while in command of the Republic, she ran aground off Sandy Hook at the entrance to New York Harbor, where she remained stuck for 5 hours before she could be floated off. Then, once in port, disaster struck again, when a furnace flue above a boiler fractured, killing 3 crewmen and injuring 7 more. Smith's next misfortune was in December 1890, when he ran the Coptic aground off Rio de Janeiro. There followed after this 11 uneventful years, during which time he served with distinction through the Boer War, captaining troop ships and earning the Transport Medal, the Reserve Decoration, and the rank of Commander in the Royal Navy Reserve, after which his ships always flew the blue ensign of the RNR rather than the British Merchant Navy's red duster. Bad luck was to befall another ship captained by Smith in 1901. This time it was the Majestic. A fire broke out in a linen closet, which was bad enough for the firefighters to cut a hole through the deck above, so that water could be poured through to put it out. 5 hours later it was raging again, filling adjacent cabins with smoke and fumes. It was eventually extinguished once and for all by the crew injecting steam. The strange thing about this event, considering that fire is one of the most feared hazards on board a ship, was that nobody told Captain Smith about it. In 1904, E.J. became Commodore of the White Star Line, and was to have the honour of captaining the company's flagships for the rest of his career, starting with the Baltic. On the 3rd of November 1906, a fire broke out in her No. 5 hold, which had to be flooded to put out the blaze. The cargo being shipped was bales of wool, of which over 600 were damaged or destroyed. After the Baltic, Smith went on to command the 24,541-ton Adriatic, which he also ran aground, approaching New York. Lastly, Smith's bad luck as commander of the Olympic has already been recorded, but to recap, in less than a year, his ship badly damaged and nearly sank the tug O.L. Halenbeck in New York, was involved in a collision with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke, and she ran over a wreck, losing a propeller blade. It's probably very unfair just to list the mishaps that befell Captain Smith in his 24 years as a commander. For at the time he took command of the Titanic, Smith was at the pinnacle of his career, as the world's highest-paid seaman, earning £1,250 per annum. From all accounts, he was trusted as an extremely competent officer by the directors of White Star. He was also well liked by all the passengers that travelled with him, and he certainly held the respect of his officers and crew. Smith also looked the part, with his long frock coat, 4 gold rings on each sleeve, and his peaked cap sitting above his comfortable, weather-beaten face, kind eyes and grey beard, in the style worn by King George V. Smith's appearance certainly radiated confidence, reliability and safety, all the things, in fact, that you want to see in a man when you put your life in his hands. Yet he had a gung-ho way about him that made him drive his commands like a speedboat. This was confirmed by a statement made by Titanic's second officer Lightoller, who said of Smith, for whom he obviously had a great deal of respect and admiration, "It was an education to see him con his ship up through the intricate channels entering New York at full speed. One particular bad corner used to make us flush with pride as he swung her round, judging his distances to a nicety, she heeling over to the helm with only a matter of feet to spare between each end of the ship and the banks." Most of the other ship's officers and department chiefs joined the Titanic in Belfast, but a last-minute change of mind by the line brought Henry T. Wilde to the ship from the Olympic to be the chief officer. This meant a realignment of the ship's senior officers. William M. Murdoch, who was to be chief, was moved down to first officer. Charles H. Lightoller, who was first, now became second. David Blair, who was second, left the ship to be reassigned. One can imagine how Blair felt a few days later when the news of the disaster was reported. The rest of the officers were unaffected. These were Herbert J. Pittman, 3rd, Joseph G. Boxall, 4th, Harold G. Lowe, 5th, and James P. Moody, 6th. As for the rest of the crew, because so many ships were marooned in Southampton owing to the coal strike, White Star had no difficulty at all in recruiting all they wanted. Most of these were to come from Southampton, but many families in London, Liverpool, Belfast and Dublin were also to grieve at the loss of the ship.